Okay, I'm the same person who was here this morning, so I just give you some feel for it. I started with Adobe 22 years ago, the days of PostScript language level 2. In and out of the print group twice, one point doing interoperability with an Adobe. There was sort of a very major break in workflows when Adobe introduced live transparency to the imaging model. I mean, a really major break. Not break as in great things, but problems. Okay, and there were a number of things that we looked at internally within Adobe. They certainly resulted in products. After we introduced live transparency in InDesign and Illustrator and Acrobat and Photoshop, we decided to try to make it work with printing. And one of the major product that came out of that was some RIP technology known as Adobe PDF Print Engine. Mike is actually the technical manager of that organization. Very important. But in doing that, there were certain things that were rather important to do simultaneously. One was to try to provide an international standard that would reflect the fact that we were now going to support live transparency with a RIP instead of making you go through stinking PostScript to get there, okay, and flattening and all the bad things that go with that. And that yielded PDF X4 and X5, but another part of it was that we saw that one of the major areas of growth in the print industry, or maybe I'll put it another way, one of the areas that wasn't doing this major decline was in personalization of printing. And we figured it would really be nice to take advantage of certain capabilities of PDF for that, to have a unified workflow. Okay, so there was sort of a strategy, get an underlying set of PDF standards that supported live transparency.
Very quickly fix something.
He's going to fix me again, okay.
So,
Continue.
I'm very sorry for that.
It's okay. You're the only attendee.
Yeah, that's going to be fixed in a moment. So, it's okay. I'm very sorry for that. We had to try to prepare for everything, but if internet goes away, so let's try to connect the audio.
Introduce computing. Still offline?
Yeah, it's trying to connect to the audio. Yeah, technology is great if it works.
So who's working in the cloud? So far?
Not a cloud in the sky.
Yeah. Yeah, but for employees it's nice. You just can say, can't do.
Yeah. Sunshine.
Du bist jetzt auch eingeloggt, oder?
Yeah, sure. Man. But if it's up to you, you run a business, that's a good.
Seems to be stuck.
Dearly beloved, we've called you here.
No, it's claiming it's not connected. So.
Let me see whether my machine's connected here.
Let's
This is connected. That
put the phone out.
the hub is okay.
Yeah, I'm putting it on the hub.
Does anyone have any good stories?
So, don't know whether it's. Oh, okay. So at least we seem to be.
Yeah, you're on it.
Welcome
Okay.
to GoToWebinar.
Sorry for
Web events made easy.
the lecture round.
Yeah.
Kannst du hören jetzt?
Ja.
Hier, hast du den? Ja, genau. Okay. One more try. Only one. Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, that's okay. I'll charge you for it later.
20 minutes left.
Okay, so the thing was that we looked at, we needed a standard above PDF X4 and X5 to provide support for personalization. Okay, and in terms of the print industry, their interest in it was basically because this is one of the few areas of growth that certainly in terms of what the print industry can charge, as opposed to charging per sheet of paper that has imaging on it. Personalized printing, personalized publishing tends to be charged for in terms of an overall cost. You're getting a value out of the thing as opposed to just pieces of paper that are printed. And then finally, there's another aspect of this, and that is that you want the cost of this to be relatively low, or as low as possible. And in the past, personalization workflows were totally different from the workflow that we would use for traditional printing. If you were able to use PDF for traditional printing, you were being told by vendors to use something else for personalized printing. And this is a bit of a problem, okay, for some fairly obvious reasons. The idea is to have something called a unified workflow. We use the same basic tools. There are obviously some differences when you want to do personalization, but once you have a final form file format, you'd be able to basically use the same mechanisms. So that was really what was behind this whole thing, and certainly why the print industry should be interested in it. Okay, so basic 10,000-foot view. What is PDF VT? It's an ISO standard developed by Technical Committee 130, Working Group 2, Task Force 3. It was published in August of 2010. This is the first paragraph out of the specification, but really what it is, it's a subset, final form file format. It's about to meet the needs of personalized transactional printing. Okay, it represents fully composited content. In other words, we're not trying to merge variables with some sort of constant thing on the fly. In other words, it's a final form file format. It doesn't change once you've produced this PDF VT. No variables in it. It's optimized to tackle issues of graphical complexity, rendering performance, and production all together. It's based on top of the existing, relatively short term before, PDF standards, PDF X4 and X5, and PDF VT has multiple conformance levels. Okay, so this is sort of the outside view of what this is. Okay, for those who don't know what it is, a quick view of what it is. Variable data printing or publishing is basically, in the case of printing, a print run where potentially every page is different or every copy is different. Typically, there's some content that is constant, some that is different. Examples of everything from phone bills through personalized types of marketing things you may get in the mail. They stick your name in, they might put your name in the sand on the beach. Any number of gimmicks to get your attention, to show that they know who you are and that they understand your particular needs. Some are successful, some aren't, but nonetheless, that's what variable data printing is.
So, let me ask you a question.
Yes.
It just came to my mind. The optimization you were talking about is more to optimize the output of the static content and not the variable content.
All content. Hold the question.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. There's one part of it. There's PDF VT. V is for variable data and T is for transactional. Back when we first started looking at this, we tended to think that perhaps PDF VT might be really great for printing phone bills and utility bills, things that are very transactional in nature. The problem is, well, maybe it's good, bad, or different, is that the amount of printing of this type of material is going down dramatically. Okay, if you're anything like me, you're getting messages like this from your phone company, from your cable company. You do away with the bills. Okay, we'll send you an online bill, which surprisingly enough is a PDF file. Okay, or they send you an email, go get the bill, and it's a PDF file. Okay, and by the way, give us your bank account number and we'll just directly charge you for it. You don't even have to look at the thing, but that's a separate issue. We're not going to get involved with that. But the thing is that they're not going to not send you communications anymore. They don't want to send you those bills, which are typically produced on these gigantic, warehouses full of Docutex and similar high-speed printers just crunching out reams upon reams, rolls of paper to literally millions of people. Okay, so that's going away. So that particular aspect of that we thought PDF VT might be used for, consider it gone. It really is an aspect that is going away very quickly. Okay, but what is important is what remains is what we call trans-promotional printing, where essentially there might be some transactional information there. For example, a financial statement from a stock brokerage. It might show, how many shares of Last National Bank and Trust Company, Consolidated Framis, whatever you own, but it might give you a very big chart, a pie chart showing the allocation of your assets. It might show you charts showing how they think they'd like to take your money and invest it someplace, whether good, bad, or indifferent. But nonetheless, very personalized, typically very graphically rich. Part of what is sent to you is constant. In other words, the usual, these are our terms, conditions, whatever. Parts of it are very personalized. The exact percentage really depends upon the particular piece that they're trying to put out there. Okay, so for our purposes, when we're talking about VDP, we're talking about highly personalized, graphically rich images, charts, color, transparency effects, everything, printing based upon some sort of database, business rules and templates, all pulled together, and especially what we're calling trans-promotional printing. Okay. Typically, the way this is implemented is you start off with some sort of business rules. Okay, what is it you're trying to do? Some sort of template. What is it that we're trying to send out? What's the general look of it? Some sort of databases, the information you're running this against. You feed that into some type of layout program. It might be a general one like InDesign. It could be a specialized package out there. There are a number of them that do that. In the case of something like InDesign, there's typically a third-party plugin that it facilitates this merger here and deals with some of the technical issues there, which we're not going to get into. And then on the outside, you would either have output perhaps aimed towards things such as web or mobile devices, maybe personalized email, personalized URLs. On the other side, output for printing. And there have been any number of ways of doing this. Yes?
Can you comment on how those functions are separated spatially? So do people create, are you intent that people create this variable data upstream and then set the PDFX to the service provider? Because the transactional jobs or use cases I know, mostly the service provider get all the junk, everything there is.
It can be done. It can be done either way. Right now, because of the tight connection between the language or the means of producing this personalized output, you almost are forcing a situation whereby the print service provider and the printer are physically there, and that all you send to them are the things on the left side. You send that to the print service provider, and they take care of it. Okay, something that is highly tied to a particular print device is problematic that way. Under a scheme where you're using a standard such as PDF VT, our hope is to allow you the choice. Okay, you might do all the things on the left on one side and print it someplace else in the world. Have it highly distributed.
Like late binding and early binding, and for the late binding, it's kind of not so important, because if you have XMPy, for instance, you do it in a proprietary way. You just print it, and there's no need of exchange anymore. And that final.
Well, XMPy is going towards what we're talking about, also. Okay.
Okay.
Matter of fact, Ruvain Sherwin was actually having discussions with me back around 2002. Wouldn't it be nice if? And we were thinking the same things. Which, oh goodness, let's talk some more. Okay. And that was a part of the genesis of this whole thing. Okay. By the way, it'd be nice if it handled transparency. All these things, great minds tend to think together, and I love working with people with great minds, because that helps me look good. Okay, let's continue on. The pundits in the industry, Frank Romano, some of you know him. He's the guy who doesn't take planes. He's currently on a ship all the way around the world trying to get to Drupa. He'll get there in time, we hope. He saw way back when that, this was a real issue, that it was very difficult for print service providers to really do this. For them, it was a totally different world, and they were being tied into particular vendors. Okay, as a matter of fact, he was hot on a particular standard called PPML VDX, which I'll mention in a few minutes, which is sort of the worst of PPML and PDF combined, but nonetheless. Okay, well, what are the problems with any of the non-PDF VDP solutions? Certainly, there's an issue of what can you put in your content. Can you use all the imaging model that you would have in something like InDesign, all the transparency, all the color modes, whatever? That's a problem. Pre-flighting and proofing. How do you pre-flight or proof something that's proprietary, other than sending it to the, doing part of the gigantic run on that big printer? Wouldn't it be nice if I could print a few pages on a cheap local inkjet? Can't do that with most of the solutions. Edit or touch-up facilities. You wouldn't want to do that on a VDP job, but it is not possible. You can't do that with PostScript. You can't do it with PPML very easily. How do you search or archive any of this material? Okay, and this is something, if you think sort of like a business person and, you've taken a few business law courses like I have, you start thinking, well, companies are sort of required to be able to show what is it that you sent this person. Or maybe you want to reprint, or you have to keep this for archival purposes. It's not particularly easy to save a PPML file and say, show me what I sent to Anthony A. Aardvark in March of 1999 or something like that. It's who even keeps those intermediate things. Something like PDF might be a solution for that. Severe vendor dependencies. And what happens is vendors, and I'm talking about print vendors, tend to lock on the print service providers. And in many cases, it's sort of a bait and switch type of thing. Come to us. We have a standard called PPML. And this is very typically what happens. Then when you bring in that vendor, they say, well, don't use PPML. It's not really good. We have SuperWizzo, which is our own thing, and use that for your variable data printing. And at that particular point, once you've tied into that, you're stuck. You can't move to another vendor because they don't have SuperWizzo, and even if they had PPML, their PPML is different from someone else's, okay? It's a case of some standards are more standard than others. PPML isn't quite all that standard, okay? Lack of unified workflow. In other words, for this variable data printing, you're using something very different than you would use for regular, who I'll call regular digital printing. Okay, much less worrying about things such as offset printing. It's a totally different language, totally different processes, which means you need people who are trained in different things. And if you're in the print business, you want to limit the number of people there. You want sort of a lights out type of workflow. One workflow is a lot better than multiple ones. I mentioned this other little standard. There's PPML, but something called PPML VDX. It was sort of a combination of PPML and PDF combined. It was actually an ISO standard 16612 Part 1. PDF VT is Part 2. We're actually looking at whether we should even keep Part 1 around anymore because only one vendor ever implemented it. And many of the problems with these non-PDF VDP solutions have to do with the fact that they're either based on top of some sort of PostScript solution. They sort of translate something into PostScript. PPML, for the most part, is translated into PostScript. Why? One of the major file format supports is EPS. So either you have to take EPS and bring it into something else, or you have to convert everything into PostScript and have the EPS sort of fit into it. Okay, in PostScript, hey, Adobe did very well by it. It doesn't support the full imaging model, and it has certain issues. It doesn't support lots of things related to optimization of streams of data. Okay, well, what happens if you say, well, PDF sounds good, I'll just use that as it is? Well, there are performance issues. If you don't constrain it in some way, if you just sort of say right out of the box, I'll generate PDF, the time it takes to produce a PDF file where you have thousands upon thousands of records and you're just spewing out pages and pages worth of PDF equivalent, and all this stuff gathers up. You're not only talking gigabytes, you could be talking about terabytes worth of data for a long run. Bloated file size, that's part and parcel of the same thing. And then ultimately, how do you print this thing on printers that conceivably are going over 100 pages a minute, or in some cases, some of the continuous, some of the web inkjet printers these days, 200, 300 pages a minute, either out there or being planned. And so these are problems. We contend the problem isn't the file format itself, but there are things that could be done. And a lot of the thoughts that people had, the early parts of this past decade, were related to the same type of thing. Okay, now just to quickly give you some examples here of the differences. Just going all the way to the left, we have PostScript with maybe some augmentation, all the way to PDF VT. Okay, obviously when you go to the left, they have the fewest things: no live transparency, no support for layers, no support for random access. Ever try getting the 533rd page of a PostScript file to print? You have to process the whole thing, ignoring the actual print until you get to that page. That could be very painful and time consuming. Blind exchange? Hell no. PostScript is very difficult that way. Image optimization? Well, there was something called PostScript forms, but it never was fully implemented. And there have been some, specialized implementations that tried to extend that, but basically not really. How do you sort of view or a PostScript file? You convert it to PDF. So, okay. File size is typically very large, and typically vendor and device dependent. That's one of the problems of PostScript. PPML is a good attempt to try doing something about this. It's XML based with an ability to place all sorts of other formats, but ultimately, because there's EPS support, it comes down to a PostScript-like type of thing. The latest version of PPML has some transparency, but not all of them, which means you can only limit to certain parts of the imaging model and flatten everything else, which means it's already ruined. Some color management, no layer support, no blind exchange because of the difficulty that there is in terms of compatibility. There is object optimization. They try to do something there. How do you view a PPML file? Well, you get it to PostScript, then PostScript to PDF. It's sort of a pattern here. Pre-flighting is difficult. It is a reasonably compact format. It's very vendor device dependent, and so none of this is a unified workflow. Proprietary stuff gets even worse because it's totally, off the rack. It might be based on PostScript or even something else. Don't know. PDF X4 and X5 itself basically can solve all these problems, but it's not particularly well suited for the production side, and it really has nothing on top of it that says these are things that you really should do. Okay, now this is something that's very different about PDF VT versus the other PDF standards, and that is it comes with a religion. It comes with a certain DNA associated with it, and that's a lot of what we're going to talk about. Just sort of a quick thing, it is becoming people are talking about it, there are RIPs that are supporting it, and we're beginning to see application programs that actually generate it, but we're at the beginning of that cycle. Yes?
When you see a workflow, what are the properties for a workflow to become a unified workflow?
A unified workflow essentially means that you use the same tools for submitting jobs, for the page description language, for previewing pages,
you mean
proofing pages.
You work on the native description language or something?
Yes, I'll give you an example of what isn't. If my non-VDP jobs are done in PostScript, let's say I have a native PostScript RIP, okay? I can preview those pages, I can proof them, any number of things, but I have a VDP job that's coming in PPML in a separate language processor in the RIP, or maybe even a separate RIP on that engine. It means I have a separate set of people who have the skills to deal with that, a separate workflow. I want to look at some of those pages. I have to do special things. That is a non-unified workflow.
So if I have a proofer and I get a PDFX and I proof it with an Epson using an Harlequin 9, being able to natively render transparency,
yes.
It is not a unified workflow.
If you have a
global graphics RIP,
yes,
and using this for proofing the PDF and print engine 2.5 for printing it actually in a print shop, that is considered a unified workflow or not?
You're using the same type of tools,
So it is unified. So it's the opposite of what Leonard calls refrying. Refrying he calls when I go to PDF, PostScript, and then back to
that's the opposite, because you're going through all sorts of extra steps to try getting this output. Having two different RIPs from different manufacturers, if long as they obey the same rules, that is a unified workflow. Obviously we'd love you to buy only from Adobe, but the fact is my friend Martin Bailey has a good product. I'm not going to diss at all. They've been working, he was very much involved with this, and I'm very glad. I have to tell you something very important. It's very good to have competitors. You know why?
You're recording.
Otherwise, you're not an important
Because
business.
if you have something which no one cares to try doing what you're doing, it probably isn't important. Okay? So I'm glad I have a competitor that keeps me honest. Okay.
And that's the reason why we do test pages, to test these devices.
Okay.
They comply to the standard.
Good. Okay. Can I continue on? Okay. Basically, this is happening in the process now. One of the things that's sort of difficult for this is basically a chicken and egg type of thing. And that is basically people who are developing software for VDP. Well, and when there's a RIP, we'll develop software. And sort of, well, the manufacturers, well, when we have the software that produces PDFVT, we'll make sure to put front ends onto our RIPs to support it. Okay, well, we're going to try breaking that by, hopefully some of you are developers. How many of you are developers? 1, 2. Good, wonderful. So you're the right audience for here. Hopefully either you're doing work related to PDFVT or you want to know more about it, etc. Okay, but anyway, this is happening. It's getting publicity. We won our award and whatever. We're not doing any changes to the standard right now, mainly because we want to see how it plays out. No reason to change anything until we know there's something that we really need to change. Okay, and certainly since we're on top of things such as PDF X4 and X5, well, we're not going to change anything really until that thing change. Those underlying standards change in any way. Okay, well, let's sort of move off a little bit. One of the major things that got people like Ruvain Sherwin and myself talking, and Tim Donahue of Kodak, was we also had this thing, hey, you know, there's something interesting inside of PDF that no one really uses too much, but you know, it just might serve the needs of VDP. And that is this thing known as an X object. And there are 3 types of X objects that are rather interesting. One is something called an image X object, where you take a raster image, define it once, then call it out over and over and over again. The second is something called a forms X object. Forget what the word forms might mean in your mind, but typically the original idea was, well, you could set a form in the background and define it once, whatever. But nonetheless, a forms X object is a combination of raster objects, vector objects, and text objects. Any combination of those combined together, and you say, this is something which is effectively a constant, and I can call it out again and again and again. I can call it out only once, but that doesn't make too much sense to call it a forms X object. Then there's a third concept called a reference X object, where you have a page of an external PDF file that you call in. Okay, you have a file ID to get it. You bring it and say, that page, the whole page is an X object, without it explicitly being defined that way. Now, there's some interesting things beyond this. You can nest forms X objects and reference X objects. You can't be recursive, obviously, since this isn't a programming language. That wouldn't work too well. Okay. Graphic states. It turns out that a X object can be influenced by what the current graphic state is. And there's some pluses and minuses on that. I can see the steam already coming up. Wow, I can do some interesting things. I have something, one guy called once, I have it red on the outside, and I call it, it's going to paint red, and the next time blue, whatever. That's not always the best idea, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. Okay. So how these might be useful? How might these be useful for VDP? Well, first of all, if I effectively invert a file, take everything that's common and define it as these X objects, I can conceivably dramatically decrease the size of a file where there's a lot in common. Okay, obviously it depends upon the particular job you're doing and how you're laying the thing out, but this could be rather good, okay? Certainly, if you know about this, if you basically set up your PDF generation based on combining things you know about, the time it takes to generate the file can be reduced dramatically too. Because you have a picture of that 1975 Dodge Dart or whatever it is here that you're going to put in in a good number of these instances of your VDP job. You know you've defined it once. You know you have a handle for it for the X object. Rather than sending that data out each time, you just refer to it over and over and over again. That's a lot faster than having to generate another JPEG image or whatever and shove it out into a file. And certainly, if you start the mind really starts going again, wow, you know, if I have these X objects and I have a really smart RIP that knows about them and can play games with caching these things, wow, I might be able to go through a VDP job like a hot knife through butter, because I've basically, you know, staged everything. Once I interpreted one time or maybe two times, whatever, I know that this might repeat, and I could just keep on calling it back in without reinterpreting it over and over again. So this was basically the idea of the people who yeah, let's come up with a standard for this. Okay, that was the genesis of this, and it's the X objects, and that's really the first thing that really got to us in terms of this is something the basis for a new standard. Okay, well, what are the minimal requirements for a PDF ET file? Well, it conforms to one of three different conformance levels. We'll talk about that in a bit. If it's a PDF VT1 file or VT2 file, it has certain attributes in terms of how you identify it. I'll leave that up to the nerds to look at. A VT2S conformance level is not a PDF file at all. It's a MIME package consisting of chunks of a PDF file. We'll give some more about that also. PDFX it has a requirement that it's layered on top of PDF VT has a requirement that it's layered on top of PDFX. If you have a PDF VT1 file, it is layered. It must also be a PDF X4 file. If you have a PDF VT2 file, it must be either a X4P, a 5G, or a 5PG. 5PG is not parental guidance. It's profile and graphics external. G is for graphic external. P is profile external. Okay. They must also have something known as a document part hierarchy for metadata, and a minimal one defined in the file. Okay, and perhaps when we talk about the libraries, we'll hear a bit about what that really means. But this is the base for metadata, and metadata is very important to PDF VT. We'll get into that a little bit farther down. Okay, the requirement is you have to have a D-part root key in the catalog, and you have to have one D-part dictionary. You have that, and it's a perfectly kosher PDF VT1 file or VT2 file. Okay, that is not necessarily a good one, but it'll pass the test. What isn't required is rather interesting. There is nothing in there that's in the PDF VT file specifications that you must really take advantage of PDF X4 and X5. There's also nothing that says you must actually use X objects. And there's nothing that says you must have meaningful metadata. You just have to have a way of the root for expressing it. Okay? So we're basically expressing the outline of a religion here, but we're not saying exactly how you must observe it. Okay, how religious you must be. The fact is that PDF VT really has a DNA associated with it, and that's what we'll spend a few minutes talking about. In summary, this DNA is, first of all, that we're based upon PDF X4 and X5. Second of all, that we're using X objects to represent objects that are reused. Third, that we use one of these conformance levels. 3, that we have metadata for 3 specific purposes that are available. And we'll talk about these individually. One is for the scope of an X object, what the scope is of the use of that X object. We'll talk about something called encapsulated X objects, and also document part metadata to help in the production purposes. And a lot of that Mike Scruton will talk about after the break. And finally, that job tickets interfaces with the PDF VT files metadata for print production. And this is something very important here. And it's really totally different from any of the other standards. None of the other standards talk about how do you actually control the thing. And one of the reasons why it took so long to do the PDF VT standard was we thought about this because that was one of the key goals, to be able to have something that was easy for production purposes and that there were some standards for. Okay, let's go on into some of the details of this DNA. We're based on PDF X4 and X5 standards. PDF X4 and X5 support the complete imaging model. We heard 7 minutes worth of this before. Includes live transparency, color management, layers, what we call optional content if you want it, JPEG 2000 image compression, and also very important is that beginning with PDF 1.5, which was Acrobat 6, we had something known as compressed object streams. And things that aren't images that are compressed like JPEG or JPEG 2000 were much more highly compressed in PDF, starting with PDF 1.5 than they were in previous versions of PDF. And compression and cutting the file size down is rather important if you're talking about possibly hundreds of thousands of instances of something being sent out to recipients. Okay? The interesting thing is neither PDF VT nor these underlying standards require that you take advantage of these features. So the point is you should take advantage of these features when you're dealing with PDF VT. Okay, why? Well, I think in terms of live transparency, certainly the religion is that if you don't have live transparency in a PDF file, you have basically device-dependent PDF, because when you reconcile transparency, what we call flattening, you need to know the device's resolution, you need to know color spaces, etc. So if you do this ahead of time, you're effectively tying yourself to a particular device, particular resolution, color space, etc. But for PDF VT, it's more of a problem because you're going to be, when you flatten, you typically have a larger amount of content because you may have text and vector suddenly becoming part of a raster if they're intersecting with that. Okay, so you're getting larger blobs of stuff. You're also possibly eliminating the possibility of being able to use X objects in certain cases because things that might be independent in one case aren't in another because you've done the flattening. Something that is, let's say, an X object on top of something else and you're reconciling the transparency, well, you're now tied in with what was underneath. So you want to take advantage of those capabilities of PDF X4 and X5. Certainly, maintaining content with the original color space allows for repurposing of output. And also, if you maintain imagery, let's say you originally shot with digital cameras, everything's shot with digital cameras these days, right? Right. 3 colorings versus 4, you're definitely going to be a smaller file size. And when you start talking about many gigabytes or possibly terabytes, that is important. Okay, and certainly compressed object streams yield more compact PDF files. So you might as well use these capabilities. Okay, X objects. Okay, well, what about them? Well, PDF VT1 is based on PDF X4, and it's totally self-contained. Okay, that means you could use image X objects and forms X objects. PDF VT2 is based on PDF X5G or X5PG, can also use reference X objects. In other words, referring to an outside file. Of course, as I said, we don't require that you use X objects, but that loses the advantage that you might have. The idea is basically to prudently use X objects, and that gives you a potentially dramatic file size decrease and potentially dramatic improvements in the rendering if you use these X objects in a rational fashion, okay? And you have a RIP technology that knows how to deal with it. One of the things you want to avoid doing is gratuitously using X objects, okay? I mentioned the word inversion before. When you use X objects, you're effectively inverting the file structure. Well, what does that mean? I'm not saying turn it upside down, but effectively, you're taking everything common and moving it into some sort of definition. There's such a concept of an inverted database where you're referring to values in a table someplace else as opposed to having the values in each record. That's a similar type of concept here. Conceivably, every time you use Times Roman with a lowercase a, you can make an X object out of that. The overhead of doing that is ridiculous. So the idea is to try to have a balance between what makes sense to have as an X object, a complex graphic, an image perhaps with some sort of customization that's interesting, versus something that's what I'll call very gratuitous use, where you're just trying to prove that you can do it. Proving you can do it's going to bloat the file, and it's certainly not going to make it any faster to render. There's another concept that is introduced in PDF-VT. It's not part of the PDF spec itself, called an encapsulated X object. And this is rather important. The idea is that you have an X object with a limited interaction with its environment. You'll recall before I mentioned this could be rather interesting. I define, let's say, something that looks like a picture of a suitcase. Let's give that as an example. And I make an X object, but I don't define the color in that X object, but I define it outside the X object. So one case I could call it, and the current color happens to be red. Next time I call it, it's black. Next time it's blue, whatever. That's interesting. But one has to be careful, because that means that you can't as easily cache that object. Okay? So you might be able to cache the interpretation of it, but the full object itself can't be cached. Or you might cache it, but you have to have multiple levels of caching and differentiate between the red cached object and the blue cached object. Same is true with the different sizes, magnifications, angles, etc. And this is very RIP dependent, but nonetheless, in generating PDF-VT, you have to think about these things. And it's trade-offs. And it's not always easy to determine what those trade-offs are and how to do them. But you have to be aware of that. You want to ensure a consistent rendering independent of the calling context. That's the idea behind encapsulated X objects. And we actually have a means of marking an X object as encapsulated, sort of as a hint for the RIP. Hey, this is something you don't have to worry too much about. Or you have limited worries compared to something where we know nothing about it. Okay. There's something called usage scope hints metadata. We'll talk some more about it, but things about whether an X object is only used once, whether it's used multiple times, whether it has a scope throughout the file of a particular record. These are important or could be important as part of the ripping of the PDF-VT file as well. But again, this is part of the DNA. There's nothing that says you have to do this. We provide the mechanisms for it. Okay, let's get into these conformance levels. I've hinted at them a bit. Let's sort of go into them a bit better. PDF-VT1 is blind exchange. It's based on PDF-X4. All the assets are there. If one is looking for something that is the safest, most reliable, you don't have to worry about it potentially. You always have to worry about it, but least potential for worrying about it. PDF-VT1 is it, because all the fonts are there, all the assets are there, all the profiles are there. Okay, it's the only things that could be changed about the print production are the external production instructions, but otherwise it's deterministic. The page is always going to print the same. Okay, and it has the potentially highest performance. Why? Because everything's there. PDF-VT2 extends similar to the standard for PDF-VT the same way the PDF-X5, PG, and G, and PDF-X4P extend PDF-X4. They allow some external aspect of the file. The P is for simply the output intent profile. That's usually something relatively simple. But when you get to the G portions of it, that becomes rather interesting. It means that there's references to there are reference X objects, which means you're referencing an external PDF file. Well, that immediately brings some degree of variability into this. And of course, someone could come and say, can't I use that as a way of sort of substituting things on the fly? Possibly, but you don't want to do that. That sort of kills the feature here. And if that happens, it usually means you have an error, not something that you meant to do. But the thing is that you can have that external X object on the same computer. You can have it over in Maui, Hawaii. You can have it on the moon, conceivably. Any place where there is a way of getting to it via the internet, via some type of file specification, you can do this. So that conceivably could have some performance implications. You might cache it ultimately locally, but, okay, so this is a concern. The other thing is the issue of asset conversion to PDF. And this has come up a number of times in speaking with some of my dear OEM partners. If you take a look at how the graphics world is today, and you go out for imagery, what does most of that imagery start as? All at once? EPS, TIFF, JPEGs, these gigantic storage things with all this stuff. Well, the typical question coming to us is, well, if I support PDF VT2 and I want to go to glurbish.pdf and I don't have glurbish.pdf out there and I find glurbish.tiff, what can I do? Well, this standard doesn't address that. Okay, and that could be an issue. So that means I really have to go through all the assets I have out there and convert them to PDF. So that can be an issue. If I bring them all into a VT1 file, I obviously don't have the problem. I solve the problem at compositing time and generation of PDF time. So there are some issues here that you have to deal with. Okay, PDF VT2S, S is for streaming. The typical thing that was told to us as a requirement was, but I have these print jobs that run forever. They're in PostScript, and it starts on Monday and then finishes 3 months later on, and I keep on generating PostScript as these docutexts are streaming out all these phone bills and whatever else. So we said, well, you can't quite do that with PDF. There's no such thing as sort of an infinite PDF file. We could conceivably start fooling around with PDF structure, but that would require changing the base definition of PDF. It isn't worth it. Let's talk about chunks of PDF. The idea behind PDF VT2S is you have chunks of the print job as individual PDF files. They can share XObject definitions, they can share metadata, and we can have some hints in there in terms of which of these XObjects are shared between the particular segments. Okay, it becomes rather sophisticated. I don't know if there are any implementations yet. I know we're planning it on our RIP side, but nonetheless, this is not something particularly easy.
Are these self-contained PDF files, each chunk?
They can be, but they typically is a relationship. The idea is that you want to be able to define things in, let's say, the first chunk that are reused over and over again. So it's effectively a reference X object, and you're saying, well, it's someplace else where someplace else has already been processed, and you've said at the time with metadata, hey, save this X object because I'm going to use it. The scope of it is for the entire stream, the entire job.
So you wouldn't be able to open part 5 in Reader, for instance?
You could, yes, you could. But it would try looking for that external, that reference X object someplace else. Okay, and the game with this MIME packaging is that we're playing this coconut shell game trying to...
So the references are always to external objects, not to internal?
They can be internal.
Okay.
I can make a PDF VT2S file, perfectly legal one, that's just a bunch of PDF VT1 files strung together. That's perfectly valid. Okay. Recommendation from given how early we are in this is KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. At this particular stage, if someone just asked me what they should do, I would say try to use the lowest level conformance level that you possibly can. Okay, and that if you do a good job in actually putting together a PDF VT1 file, you actually may have more optimization there than you realize. Okay, and that disk drives are cheap these days. A terabyte PDF VT file can contain an awful lot of variable data, especially if you use XObjects appropriately. I'm not saying you shouldn't use these others, but there certainly are some things that I would try with the simpler one first. Let's leave it at that. We'll be getting, certainly as an industry, we'll be getting experience in terms of how much you can do at the lower level conformance and when you really have to move to the higher level. Remember, we're in the early days of actually generating these files, using these files, etc. There's a lot we all have to learn.
Can you comment on the difference to ASP data streams used in that instance? Because they have a lot of more of interaction, what happens then, and to make the data integrity is much more important there. How to separate
AFP is
them.
for printing phone bills. We don't print phone bills anymore. No, I'm not trying to be funny. There was an effort in the design of VT2S to maintain reasonable integrity there. It is not it's not designed for this transactional thing that AFP is. It's a totally different marketplace. My personal belief is you'll find that most of the chunking is done totally independently.
Okay.
You know, but we'll have to see. Again, you guys are going to be generating this stuff. I want to see what sort of interesting things you can do. If you break it, we'll worry about fixing the spec. But let's see what you need before we try to overcomplicate the spec such a way that it's difficult to write to. I think we tried to make some reasonable compromises there. Okay? Continue on. Metadata. This is a very key, important aspect of PDF VT, of its DNA. Well, first of all, we mentioned that X objects. How am I doing on time?
You're at time.
Okay, I'll make this fast. We're almost near the
We
end.
lost a few minutes, so it's okay to go for another 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, fine. I'll get there. I'm pretty sure I'll get there. I'll get there. We're near the end. Good. Page number doesn't show on this monitor. Metadata was certainly we have capabilities of the scopes of a particular X object, and this is rather important. There are values for this GTS scope key. You can say that a X object is used only once. Use for that is simple. A RIP sees that, it's not going to even try to cache the thing. If you say that it is for a record, it means that only keep this X object while processing a particular instance. Now, this is one thing that's a little bit different in PDF VT as opposed to regular PDF, and that is we have the concept of a record. Let's say all the pages associated with my particular financials, okay, as opposed to yours or yours or yours. And some of the metadata helps divide it up that way. This says that a particular X object is only associated with things in my particular record. Stream relates to the VT2S stream. Global can be even outside of a PDF VT job itself. You know, cache it forever. Okay. This is used as hinting so that the RIP can make reasonable sense and do optimizations. There's no requirement that the RIP to do this, but it helps the RIP if it finds the thing, and the RIP is a setup to use that. Okay. One thing that is true is if you do use this key, don't lie, because that can really hurt your performance. We mentioned encapsulated X object. We have a key for that, GTS underbar encapsulated, and this helps with the caching of these particular objects so that we can optimize on the fact we know that there's limited interaction with the current graphic state. Document part metadata. Now this is the interesting thing. Mike will give you an awful lot more about this, but basically this is allows you to interface between the particular externals and internals. Okay, in other words, I have a job ticket. I could say print. I could filter. You know, I want the 5th page of the entire PDF ET file, or give me the first 5,000 page sets, the first 5,000 customers. Each one of these page sets might be a variable number of pages. I can filter on particular values that may have been on the original database. If I put this metadata in, you know, give me all left-handed herniated Italians who own a Fiat. Okay, if that is information which I happen to carry into this metadata, the JDF can interface with that. Okay, I know that's an extreme example, but if you need to be able to extract only parts of this for printing or for viewing, whatever purpose, this is something that is different from anything else we've done in the past. Or I want to print only the cover pages. Suppose I'm printing on one device that is only loaded with this, you know, glossy, thick stock. This will do, and this particular printer, I'll just say print the cover pages, and the other one I'll say print the text pages. The other one print the envelope. Then I might have equipment that merges it at the end.
Do you expect the output RIP to find the corresponding pages?
The RIP, compliant RIP will do this. Mike will discuss this some more. Right, Mike?
Yep.
Yes. Good. Thank you.
But it would also be a feature of a reader, for instance, a viewer.
A viewer may do this. Right now, none are. Typically, we see this as something that will be primarily a RIP thing because readers typically don't have JDF or job ticket capabilities. There's nothing, let's say, to prevent someone from producing a plug-in to Acrobat, for example, that implements this. You know, find me the you know, whatever. Okay, I won't go through that again. But no, you're right. This can be implemented there. We initially see this as the most useful when it comes to the actual WIP process. Although certainly anything that accesses the file could conceivably do this. Okay, I'll give you one last example related to this. You could conceivably, let's say, you archive your phone bills, let's say, as PDF, as a gigantic PDF VT file. Someone calls in and says, "I need my bill from March." A query could go in to extract those pages from a gigantic PDF VT file based upon name and the date and whatever. Okay.
Then you want to see it on the monitor, not running to your production printer.
Yes, it might even be printing these at all. The example might be if I call, as a matter of fact, with AT&T, I want my bill from last March. Right now, I think they generate it on the fly, but conceivably it could have been a big PDF VT file for which they do the query very quickly and just do a quick extract of those pages and give that to me as an independent PDF file. So a number of things, once you start thinking about it, this becomes very interesting. And the assumption of PDF VT is you do have a job ticket mechanism. We keep on mentioning JDF, although it isn't a requirement to use JDF. Hint, hint. Okay. One last topic, and that is it's not just the PDF. It's something I'll call intelligent design. For those of you who might know, in the United States, this is sort of a bad pun on a particular political thing, but nonetheless, it's very easy to produce a perfectly valid PDF VT file that's really bloated in size and cannot print with speed. A designer can, you know, if you take a look at the early years of PostScript, those of you who remember that, some of you definitely were born after that, but some of the early examples, you had people who produced pages in which they tried to show that they could use every single font that was resident in a PostScript printer in every orientation, every point size. It looked like a ransom note. You can do the same thing with variable data publishing, just too much crap on a page, too many effects, whatever. There's no accounting for that sort of taste. And quite frankly, it doesn't necessarily buy you something that's more effective in terms of marketing whatever you're doing. So even though we support all this graphical richness, use it appropriately, okay? Avoid gratuitous use of transparency effects. I know it's nice to show you all 16 blend modes work on a page, but you don't have to do that, okay? Avoid gratuitous variable data. You don't have to tell everyone on every variable data thing you have that you know that they have a turtle named Merle, okay, that died 3 months ago. You don't have to do all this junk there. Keep it simple, keep the design right, etc. In terms of the compositing program, the layout program, you want to consolidate common graphics and output as X objects as best as possible. You don't want to overuse the X objects. You want to carefully set the scope metadata. You don't want to make mistakes with that. Better you not specify it than specify the wrong thing. You want to optimize the performance with these encapsulated X objects, okay? I think you want to optimize away unnecessary specification of transparency. Examine the object. If there's no reason for transparency and the thing is tagged with that, turn it off when you generate the PDF file. You know, unless you know it's being reused, having something that is nothing underneath it and you say it's transparent doesn't make all that much sense and just complicates the potential the job that the RIP has to do. You don't want to do that. Okay, and you certainly want to integrate the VDP layout with PDF VT and the job ticket all at one time. You certainly want to have, your software should bring all these things together. That is part of the full DNA. Now, I also think you should think outside the bounding box, I know, bad pun, in terms of how you generate things. And I have one example here of how gross things can be. I have a beautiful picture here. It's an image. I shot it. Mono Lake, California. Nice 4.23 megabyte JPEG compressed image in a PDF file. Now, a lot of the types of effects you see people do with these variable data publishing packages is, you know, they're going to customize this and show this for every one of the recipients. So here I have Beach Reserve for John Doe. I did this in Photoshop. What some of the packages will do is they'll go out, take the image you say is being personalized, shove it to Photoshop, send it through Actions, and back comes something with multiple layers, transparency effects, and God knows what else. And that goes out for every single one of the instances. Starting to follow where I'm going here? Okay, what can be, and this, interesting is I could crop this thing, out of it, no transparency involved, it is 0.652 megabytes. I can handle this two different ways. I can have 10,000 distinct customized images, assuming I have 10,000 records in this job I'm printing. Each is 4.62 megabytes, they're each non-reusable because they're all different, they're customized, and that comes out to 46.2 gigabytes. Nothing can go in there as a reusable X object. They might be coming out as image X objects, but they'll never be reused. Alternatively, I could take the base image, cut out that little customized portion, and I only call those differ, but I'm always calling that base one there. The difference is that the base image is 4.23 megabytes. It's reusable. Every single one of these 10,000 instances. I have 10,000 small little customized things that I just place over the other. No transparency involved. Okay, the entire size of this file is 6.66 gigabytes. What would you do? This means a little bit more planning, a little bit thinking outside, you know, how people would typically do this, but this is a major type of thing that will buy you a lot.
I'm coming from the motion picture industry actually, and it looks for me like motion compression. Do you have compared to the performance of simply encoding motion picture, where you have every frame differently, like just for the efficiency part? Because it looks exactly like differential code pulse modulation, and just for as a rule of thumb.
You're outside my level of competence on that. Sorry, I'm not going to try to answer that.
No.
Okay.
I'll pick you from the motion industry.
I did this sitting in an airport lounge the other day before my flight took off. But
okay,
there are things could be done in PDF if we wanted to start getting into what you're talking about. We're not doing that at this particular point. My particular idea here is to show you that by slightly changing how you do customization for a feature, then this is a very common feature. I know a few packages that do this. You can make a dramatic difference in the performance of this PDF, of the size and the performance of this PDF ET file. Okay?
I know other people have thought of it, but I don't know of anybody who's exploited it yet. So there is an opportunity there for somebody.
There's always opportunities.
just give an idea of the efficiency.
Okay, I didn't do this in 7 minutes. I tried to stay within my time.
Yeah, you did well.
Okay? Any further questions? I'm here for 2 days, so, you know, through the end of tomorrow, so if you have ideas that come up and things you want to query, please feel free.
Just one AFP, when you ask about AFP people about PDFs, they say, okay, we can do PDF and much more, so we can just take PDFs as packages. If you think about using, how about the AFP folks would react when adding PDF PDF as their packages and more? Is it something controversial, or is it something you not recommended, or they should avoid?
AFP was designed, it still has 1403 N1 control sequences in there from IBM System 360s from the 1960s, okay? It was designed for printing bills. If you're producing output from if you're basically saying you're marrying today's layout programs, whether it's in design or Quark or you know what, or something that's totally independent, and you're going to produce something that is a single stream to do things, why in the world would you want to bring in AFP? That's, you know, I'm not trying to be argumentative, but, you know, it doesn't buy you anything to start saying I'm going to support multiple languages and some sort of hybrid here. The idea is we support the full imaging model, we support optimization. A lot of thought has gone into the optimization. Moore's law has helped us an awful lot in terms of processor speed and certainly memory availability. So why make it overly complex? This is complex enough without trying to add other things with it too. While we're at it, we could put in Diablo 630 emulation also, you know, for the... Only a few of us are old enough to even know what we're talking about here, but nonetheless. Okay, next, Stefan.
Yeah, thank you very much.